Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We're honored to have with us Raymond Ibrahim. He's a widely published author, public speaker, Middle East and Islam specialist. He was born and raised in the U.S. by Coptic Egyptian parents who were born and raised in the Middle East. He's the go-to guy on radical Islam, its persecution of Christianity. His writings, translations, observations have appeared in a variety of publications, including the New York Times, CNN, LA Times, Fox News, Financial Times, Jerusalem Post, New York Times, and the list, New York Times Syndicate, and the list goes on and on. Raymond, I appreciate you being on the Joe Miller Show. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, happy to do it, Joe. Good to be with you.
So you wrote a book. This was back in 2013, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. And I would imagine that that book has a high degree of relevance today, probably more so than the day it was published in 13, right?
Absolutely. With the rise of this ISIS, or the Islamic State, more literally, the persecution of Christians in the name of Islam has become rampant in the Middle East, especially in the Mesopotamia area, Levant, Iraq, and Syria. But it's also was relevant, of course, before then. The title of the book is, Exposing Islam's New War, and that's basically what I was referring to, which is the Islamic State and the rise of the Caliphate and so forth. But if you look at the book, you're going to see that this is actually also a very ancient war, about 1,400 years, ever since Islam came on the scene in the 7th century. And, most people aren't aware of the fact that if you took the entire Christian world in the 7th century, and Christianity was around for about 700 years at this point, or 600, two-thirds of it was conquered by the sword of Islam. And so all these countries that today we habitually think of as being Arab or Islamic innately were actually Christian countries, such as Egypt, of course, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Algeria, Libya, Morocco. All these regions were actually Christian majority. And in fact, from an ecclesiastical or clerical point of view, that region was even more Christian than Europe at the time. So I think there's a lot of history that people are not aware of, and I wrote the book to shed light on the history, but also on what's upcoming, which is what we're seeing right now. So it's a continuous war on Christianity by the sword of Islam, and we're just sitting by watching as what began in the 7th century continues unfettered today.
There really has not been a continued jihad since the 7th century today. I mean, there's been an interruption, right? I mean, at least to a degree. Or has this jihad always been alive in some part of the world without really interruption since the 7th century?
Right. Well, that's a great point. And again, that goes to the whole idea of exposing Islam's new war. So the jihad was from the 7th century in 600s, and it was continuous until the European colonial era, when Europe, again, most people are also unaware of the fact that Europe, forget about all those regions and countries I mentioned that were conquered in the 7th century and so forth. Europe itself, most people don't even know, Spain was under Islamic authority for almost half a millennium. And then, Turkey, or Anatolia, was actually the heart of the Eastern Roman Greek Byzantine Empire, and that is now Turkey. But then the Balkans were conquered, Greece, Macedonia, and Islam went all the way up to the gates of Vienna. So, Europe was constantly being harried also by the jihad until right around, 1800s. That's when there was a dramatic rise of European military economic might that, dramatically humbled the Islamic world. And then a lot of this stuff stopped, including to the indigenous Christians. Because if you look at it, 100 years ago, the treatment of Christians in the Middle East was actually a lot better than now. And the reason for that is because Islam as a force was basically spent, and most Muslims were westward looking. So if you think about Ataturk, for instance, Turkey was the standard bearer of Islam and jihad under the Ottomans, and it became the most Muslim country that secularized. And they, renounced the Arabic alphabet. They were very secular. They were dressed in suits, men shaved, women are in, skirts, dresses, no hijabs, and so forth. But then, as time went on, Muslims are going back to their roots, back to their heritage, and lo and behold, Christians are being persecuted. So it's resuming once again the lull. There was a lull, and that lull has stopped now.
Right. I mean, if you look at, for example, ancient archaeology, a lot of the old churches, for example, standing clear up until the last 20 years, right? Last 10 years. I mean, there was a degree of, and this isn't based upon my expertise, it's just based upon observation. It seems that there was a degree of compatibility, or at least tolerance, that went on fairly uninterrupted, given the existence of all of these Christian icon or Christian archaeological sites, even to some extent, some that have some Jewish connections, but now destroying them. I mean, it seems that now there is more animosity than at perhaps any time in the Middle East toward Christians by Islam.
Right. Well, I would argue a lot of that has to do with a lot of Muslims who we call Islamists going back to their true history and the true doctrines and the true teachings. Because if you look at the early history that I was referring to, 6th, 7th century and so forth, you're going to see the same sort of animosity that the Islamic State has for Christians actually recorded by pious Muslim historians, including wholesale destruction of churches. In the 11th century, under one sultan or caliph alone in Egypt, up to 30,000 churches were destroyed in Syria and Egypt under his domains. So this sort of thing has existed. It's historically documented, and it definitely has a doctrinal backing. So what happened is during that, as I was saying, the colonial era and so forth, Islam was, I mean, if you go back, for example, in my parents' day in Egypt, you look at pictures, all the women are in dresses, all the men are in suits, no one has a beard, no woman's wearing a veil. That was in an era when people were actually, Islam was just kind of like a cultural thing. No one really even read the Quran. Well, when I say no one, I'm exaggerating, but I'm just saying in general it was a spent force. But now, when people or Muslims become more pious and turn to the teachings of Islam and read these sources, they find out that Islam does what it's doing. And that's why the Islamic State is Islamic, despite what people want to say. Every single atrocity they have done, whether it's beheading or crucifying or sex slaves and raping and destroying churches, all of that has precedence in Islamic history, including at the hands of the Islamic prophet. And it's codified in what's called Sharia or Islamic law.
In this segment, we have about 4 minutes left, but I'd like to get into, obviously, some detail of what's happening to the church in the Middle East. Can you give us kind of just a brief overview of what's happened over the last 10, let's say since 9/11, or maybe if you think that there's a better date to start based upon the most current issues that are going on? What has happened to Middle Eastern Christians in numbers, and as far as whether or not there's even now, I've heard in Iraq, for example, 1 million have left, and there's not even really an extant church there anymore. Can you kind of give us an idea of what's going on?
Sure. Well, it depends on which country. So, as you said, in Iraq, that is the case. Well over, I hear different numbers, but I'm often told that it's like something like 70% or more of the entire indigenous Christian population is gone or dead from attacks previously. And it's the same thing now in Syria. It's happening right now where the Christians, it's ironic because in Syria used to be a haven for Christians who fled from Iraq. Now those Christians and the indigenous Syrian Christians are fleeing from Syria. So they're running out of places to go. But probably the one country that has the largest Christian minority, of course, is Egypt. The Coptic Christians, which is my background, they make up for at least anywhere from 10 to 15% of the entire 90 million population. So there's millions of them in Egypt, and they're actually the ones who are experiencing less of the jihad that we're seeing in Syria and Iraq, and more of a slow, the slow motion persecution, discrimination that I was alluding to, that has seen a country like Egypt go from being 100% Christian to now being 10% Christian. And if that trend continues, then obviously they're going to disappear, because the reason they're 10% from 100 is because of this sort of attack, and it's dwindling steadily.
Of course, the removal of Muslim Brotherhood as the government there, I'm sure that had they stayed in power, they would have faced even more pressure and persecution. The current regime in Egypt has been somewhat, at least, sympathetic to the Coptics, right?
Well, that's the narrative that a lot of people have believed, including myself, and I've supported that narrative. And until this day, I do believe that the Sisi government is officially and formally condemning of attacks on Copts and treating them as citizens. And he says a lot of excellent, great words, but word on the ground is nothing has improved, and in many ways it's gotten worse. And now there's a lot of belief that, Sisi is just, this is just a cosmetic game, or, he's giving lip service. But in reality, nothing's changing. Like I said, it's often getting worse. The persecution, the church attacks, the abduction of Christian girls, forcing them to become Muslim. It's actually now worse than it was under the Muslim Brotherhood, believe it or not.
The thing that has really amazed me is that under American control, things have gotten worse in a number of countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, for example. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I mean, this is it's probably much worse than you even think. Every single country that the United States has intervened in, I look at Christian persecution as the litmus test of the radicalization of a Muslim country. So where Christians get persecuted, that those becoming dominant are Muslims.
We'll pick that up after the break, and also we'll talk about Raymond's prediction for the future and what the future holds for the persecuted minorities. Stay with us. The Joe Miller Show, back with you after these messages. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have with us Raymond Ibrahim. He's a widely published author, public speaker, Middle East and Islam specialist. His books include Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, 2013. His writings, his observations appeared on a variety of publications, leading journals, newspapers, New York Times, CNN, etc. And his book, I haven't read it yet, but based upon what he's described, obviously it's helped not necessarily predict, but he certainly saw what was coming as far as what's happening with Islam versus some persecuted minorities like Christianity. And Raymond, during the break, we were talking about this right before we went to break. We were chatting a little bit about what's happened in Islamic countries that have been under the control of the United States, and how ultimately minorities such as Christians have actually ended up being under more persecution now than what they were before American intervention.
Right.
Can you tell our audience why you think that is?
Sure. Well, first to lay a little context, it's really bad because every country that I can think of, so you mentioned Afghanistan, but there's also Libya, Egypt during the Morsi era, and of course ongoing in Syria. Now, what's ironic is if you look at, there's the World Watch Monitor publishes the annual report on the persecution of Christians by ranking the worst countries in order. And what's amazing is every one of these countries is now ranked in the top 10, and they're actually considered extreme persecution, even though before the United States intervened and ousted what were secular dictators and, in the name of Arab Spring, democracy, freedom, whatever. Now, the forces that have filled the vacuum are the Islamic radicals and jihadis. So in Libya, where you never heard of the persecution of Christians because they're such a puny minority, you see what's going on. There was, for example, the 21 Coptic Christians who were beheaded on video, and then after them the 30 Ethiopian Christians. Syria, of course, you see what's ongoing, where Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities are being enslaved, raped, sold. Their churches are being bombed, and so forth. Iraq, as you can see, as we were saying, more than 70% or so are gone and destroyed. So I think it's very telling that, in Afghanistan, I was reading, I think in 2013, the last Christian church was destroyed by the government that the United States helped empower and install. So it's definitely raises a lot of question marks of, what is going on when the United States actually intervenes in the name of human rights and freedom and democracy and so forth. And you see, as I was saying, it's a litmus test because a lot of people, if they're not interested in the topic of Christian persecution, to me, though, it explains who is in power in the nations that the United States went and liberated. And in all these examples, it is the Islamists.
It amazes me. One of the things that came out just several months ago, maybe a year ago, there's real concern about minor sexual abuse in Afghanistan. And I remember reading something, a dictate that came down, I think from the brass. I don't think it came from a State Department official, basically saying that, look, soldiers can intervene when they suspect minor sexual abuse. And the implication was this was part of the culture that we aren't going to interfere with. I just find that kind of approach mind-boggling, that when you've got an area under American control and you're saying that we aren't going to intervene in this area of human rights no matter what it is because it's part of their Islamic culture or part of their culture. I mean, that surely has encouraged some of this, I would assume.
Well, definitely. But you see, I think that all is rooted back to American, postmodern American education and so forth, where everything is relative. There are no truths. There are no right and wrong. Multiculturalism, you have to appreciate every different culture and so forth. So when you go to a country, Afghanistan or whatever, and they're doing what they do, then, people who have been ingrained in this sort of upbringing can't help but feel that they should not intervene. They should let it go. Who am I to judge if they're engaging in pederasty or enslaving people or bombing churches because that's what they believe they should do? So I think this is what we're seeing, in the Middle East and elsewhere, or the Islamic world, is a byproduct, direct byproduct of sort of Western philosophy and upbringing, which has taken a very relativistic and postmodern bent that today, this is what explains all this inaction on the West part.
Well, and in fact, this was a different approach than what was used in the colonial era, right? I mean, in the colonial era, when the West ended up having contact with Islam, they weren't nearly as tolerant.
Well, that's exactly it, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. For example, in the book Crucified Again, I have a whole chapter called Might Makes Right. And if you understand and you study the history of Islam, Islam became a force when it proved itself on the battlefield, when Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and his followers started to get the upper hand, and they said Allah's on their side, and they began to plunder and grow rich and have slaves. Then people joined the bandwagon, the caravan, and they went on. So this went on for centuries, as I was saying, and Islam was on the ascendancy against, Christian Europe and so forth, until it was beating in the colonial era and so forth. And then because of the Muslim mindset, might makes right, they started looking westward to Europe. And at that time, Europeans and Westerners in general were unapologetic of their ways, and they were not relativistic or postmodernist, as I was saying. So they would actually condemn these practices. So, for example, the British in India, when they had that practice, I think it's called suti or something, where they would burn a woman after her husband dies. So right. The British, of course, didn't just stand back and say, well, we're going to respect it. They actually physically put a stop to it. And I think people respected that when they saw that sort of action. But now, so that's why there was that more tolerant era of Islam, because it was more westernized and not literal. But now, as Westerners do what we're seeing, which is stand back and say, no, your ways are fine, we're not going to intervene, then obviously Muslims and other people are falling back onto their heritage, and we're seeing all these things popping up.
So one of the things that I've struggled with, some of our audience has struggled with, is right now we're talking about Islam versus Christianity, or persecuting religious minority. And yet, when you look at Islam in practice, I mean, there are competing entities. And I want to just talk briefly about Sunni and Shia. I mean, is there a difference in approach toward Christianity or toward religious sects, minorities, between those two sects of Islam, or are they pretty much the same in their approach?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, the best way to start off is to understand who they are and why they are the way they are. Now, the majority of Muslims in the world, up to 90% or so, are Sunnis. And the split between, and then you have the Shias, who are 10%. And then within the Shias, you have all these other smaller groups, subsets of, who are Shia related. But 90% are Sunnis, but all of them split historically over a succession issue in the 7th century. It was a question of who's going to be the caliph. So you had Muhammad died, then there was Abu Bakr and Omar and so forth. Then it came to a question, there were people who wanted this caliph, some who wanted that, and then they eventually split, and the minority group, the Shias, went with another caliph. So really, it was always a succession issue. Now, as centuries went by, their theology is a little different, definitely for sure, especially from an eschatological point of view, end time days and so forth. But when it comes to the question that we're talking about, the infidel, yes, the infidel is still the enemy, the infidel, the non-Muslim. And what's ironic is, and I get this a lot when people say, well, look, Sunnis and Shias are killing each other. Obviously, it's not just about hating the infidel because they're killing fellow Muslims. But no, that's not how they see it. Sunnis and Shias see each other as apostates, as not true Muslims, and as infidels. But they're even worse infidels because they're under the mantle of Islam and trying to subvert Islam, so the theory goes. So it's really the same context. When a Sunni kills a Shia or vice versa, it's the same mentality that goes and kills a Christian or kills a non-Muslim, because they always, it's about, we are the chosen true ones. Everyone else is the enemy, the infidel, and he has to be slain, whether he calls himself a Muslim or a Christian or so forth. So I think that's the true thing that people need to keep in mind when they think about Sunnis and Shias.
So that they're a comparable threat to Christianity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Christians are often, yeah.
We don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted you to take a look to the future as to where this heads. Of course, you've got ISIS wanting to, establish a universal caliphate, ISIS primarily being Sunni related, not Shia related. Is the big threat that the Sunnis are going to continue push out, the Shia opposition and actually impose their radical version of Islam? And if so, is the Obama administration taking the correct move and siding with Iran on a number of issues?
Well, going back to what we were discussing, which is really, yes, they both fight and kill and hate each other, but there are also times where they work with each other against a common enemy. So you could have Sunnis and Shias definitely work with each other against whatever, America, Christians, Israel, and so forth. That definitely could happen. But, the overall bigger picture of what's going to happen is, I find it amazing, and I don't know how many people pay attention to this, but the United States in, I think, 2003 or 4 went into Iraq, 3 or 4, and they took Saddam out. Now, Saddam Hussein's military was one of the most organized and strongest militaries in the Middle East, and it was taken out in about 3 weeks. So I just find it mind-boggling that this little group, the Islamic State, who came up and on pickup trucks and originally not many weapons and so forth, and we just can't all get together and take them out. It's so hard. So it's just amazing to me that they're being let alone, and they keep growing in strength. They have tentacles now in Libya, in Nigeria, and of course, we were told that the Obama administration was saying there was all these setbacks. They showed us a map. Pentagon said 30% of the land's been taken from them, and it turns out all that was incorrect. And, just recently they took Ramadi in Anbar province in Iraq, which is one of the biggest areas. So it just keeps getting worse and worse. But in the end, whether, in the narrow view, if you help this sect or that sect fight the other, that might make sense. But in the long view, either one that gets power is going to become the same thing, and they both have to be treated similarly, I think.
I want to get back to your book, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. Give our audience just a quick summary and where they can get it.
Well, probably the best place, just the easiest and probably most inexpensive, is on Amazon. I think they can probably buy it for like $15 online, or you can get it from some bookstores. It's kind of politically incorrect, so not all bookstores will have it. But it did pretty well, and it's coming back because a lot of the things in it definitely not just foretold what's happening right now, but kind of even the end game, which is a depressing picture, I think, if the status quo that we're discussing remains, it doesn't change.
Well, Raymond, I appreciate your insights on this important topic and also appreciate you taking the time to share with our audience your views. Obviously, people need to be very, very aware of what's going on, putting pressure on their elected representatives to push back against the Obama administration and the complete catastrophe it's made out of the Middle East. I think it's absolutely atrocious. A country founded on religious freedom is effectively not just sitting on its hands and facilitating this persecution, but in some regard, I mean, I think an argument can be made helping to facilitate it, and that's just absolutely atrocious. But thank you again, Raymond Ibrahim, author of Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. You can get it at Amazon. Hopefully we can get this podcast up, Raymond, soon, and also it looks like we'll be putting up your American Thinker article at Restoring Liberty here in the next couple of days. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Joe.
Stay with us. We'll be back after these messages, The Joe Miller Show.